In keeping with Chevron's tradition of service throughout the 20th century, the people of Chevron bring you this program in support of public television.
I'm Bill Moyers. The 1920s have long been a puzzle to me. I was born in 1934, and in the movies I saw growing up, and in the popular literature I read, the 1920s was the decade not to have missed. Charming, crazy days, people said. The good old days, lamented people looking back from the pit of the Depression. We Americans are prone to create our legends too quickly, and we did so with the 1920s, because the cardinal sins of that era, which so captivated the myth makers, were only part of the story. In our popular collective memory, the 1920s was the decade that brought America into the automobile age, when everyone, it seemed, drove a Model T Ford. It was a decade for heroes and celebrities, in sports, in the movies, and in personal accomplishments that caused us to respond with admiration and awe. It was a time of prohibition, speakeasies, and gangsters, and of high fashion. The Roaring Twenties, they were called, and the decade did roar. But it was also a time of hard work for millions and of prejudice against radicals, labor, and blacks. It was this other side of the 20s, the unromantic side, that didn't square in my mind with the popular images. I knew from the recollections of my own parents that for many Americans, the 1920s were a time more of heavy squalls than of rainbows. My mother and father were married in 1926 in a farming community in southeastern Oklahoma. It no longer exists except for the little frame house into which they moved as a young couple. When they married, the nearest doctor lived some 50 miles away, and my parents had neither Model T nor horse and buggy to reach him, nor the money to pay him if they got there. Twin girls died for lack of prenatal care, and pneumonia almost claimed their first son. So the popular memory of the 20s has to be reconciled with these kinds of personal experiences. This program is part of that effort. We'll revisit the 20s through some film of the time and through the memories of men and women who recall the old days, both bad and good.
20s to me were a delightful time because there were no real responsibilities, and it seemed as if the world was going to run like this for a long while.
I just characterize the 20s as the dream period of all time. Everything seemed to go great, and everybody seemed to look beautiful. It was decadence, I think, is the best way I could put it in one word.
Everybody seemed to be rushing around, hoping for riches and fame. They didn't care much how they got it.
We were working so hard for so little that eventually, after 10 years of that, we produced a depression.
Looking back today, the 1920s present us with two familiar faces, and we remember both as we would old friends from our youth. One friend was Devil May Care, always ready for a good time, always in step with the latest fashions, the decade of flappers, free love, bootleg hooch, and rum runners. The other friend was more Old Shoe, someone to spend a lazy Sunday afternoon with. For all their hard times, my parents still talk about those simple joys they shared after the long days in the fields, when the pinto beans stopped boiling on the old home comfort cook stove and friends and kinfolk gathered to play dominoes. On Saturday nights, they'd take turns at different houses, moving out of one room all the furniture except the oil lamp, and then singing and dancing to midnight to tunes like Skip to My Lou, My Darling. Many Americans who lived through the 20s remember the simple pleasures of life.
We had just very small pleasures, going to the movies, going maybe on a Saturday night, a trip up the Hudson on the moonlight sail.
We had the Victrola, records galore.
People had nothing to do but visit and talk and loaf at the store, the cracker around these pot-bellied stoves in the wintertime and out in the shade in the summertime.
We went to Gray's drugstore and went downstairs and got cheap theater tickets and sat up in the peanut gallery and saw a show. And after the show was over, we'd go into Schraff's have a soda, and then we'd walk home. You know, New York was so small town at that time that you never had any fear that you couldn't walk.
What gave the 20s their excitement, however, was novelty, the hot spice to life's casserole. Americans, even as they enjoyed the old pleasures, eagerly embraced the new. For the first time in our history, women's bodies came into public view. The Miss America pageant began as a resort promotion at Atlantic City in 1921. Soon, any excuse sufficed for a beauty contest, like this chiropractor's perfect back contest. Under the fluff, a message. Victorianism was dead. Americans went wild over races, too.
It was a decade of overactivity. There was an enormous amount of just getting from one place to the other. It was mostly action, a great deal of action.
Sometimes the action didn't require speed, but stamina.
The marathon dancing was the craze, and it really was. It was kind of crazy.
Marathon dancing was blamed for some deaths by overexertion before its own collapse. But the symbolic dance of the decade was pure energy, a whirlwind of flying arms and legs, the Charleston.
She danced the Charleston, which I still think is one of the best dances ever originated.
And then there was the ultimate Charleston, 1,000 feet high, going nowhere at 90 miles an hour. It was a decade of hijinks everywhere. Everyone seemed to be clowning around. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks on a golf course. And Babe Ruth in a gymnasium. Fashion is a frivolous but accurate mirror of social change, too. During the decade, America saw more and more of a new woman, literally, as necklines plunged and hemlines climbed. By 1927, the female badges of freedom were exposed knees and a cigarette in hand. Or a cocktail. Legend gives a name to these women of the 20s, flappers. F. Scott Fitzgerald once described an ideal flapper as lovely and expensive and about 19. And there are other definitions as well.
She was somebody who strapped down her bosom and who made herself as much as she could look like she grew straight up and down.
The very short dress and long beads, it was a sort of a style that was called flapper.
The shorter the skirt, the flappier the flapper.
A flapper, a girl that went out with all the men.
Who sought to bring men to their bedrooms for funds and things of that sort.
Some people may have thought that she came from the ancient profession, but that is not true at all. She was just a gay kid who liked to dance and would go to the parties.
The girls that were flappers, of course, everybody looked up to them because they were the perfect thing, you know.
One fuel for all that restless motion was alcohol. Prohibition, begun in 1920, made drinking a crime and did cut average consumption of alcohol by 1/3. Yet Prohibition also turned millions of ordinary Americans into lawbreakers.
Some nasty, wicked eyes would peer out, and you would say, I am Ruth Gordon, and he'd say, never heard of you. Boom.
The man would come to the door and he'd say, who?